In this video, we're going to look at the features of the past simple tense and think of some ways of teaching it which can help our students understand better the notion of the past in English. The past simple has quite an easy concept to grasp. It just talks about events and actions which happened in a finished past time. However, the past simple has quite a tricky morphology because of the range of irregular verbs which exist in English. The concept behind the past simple gets a little trickier when we start comparing it to other verb forms which we use to talk about past events. For example, the present perfect, the past continuous, and the past perfect tenses all communicate slightly different views of past events. This is where the past simple becomes quite a useful teaching tool, as we can use it as a control tense to compare with other past forms and think about the slight differences in meaning which communicate the differences in the way that we view the actions or events we're talking about. So let's have a look at the concept of the past simple as communicated through the timeline.
So let's have a look at the timeline for the past simple tense. Again, we've got our time running from left to right, and this time we have the now bar over towards the right of the timeline to show that we've got lots of space there for actions which happen in the past before now. So the meaning of the past simple is that the action is complete from beginning to end, and it's completed, meaning it's finished at the time of speaking. So past simple actions must have happened in a finished time period. For example, yesterday, last week, last month, last year, or amount of time ago, or a number of days or weeks or whatever ago. These are all completed times, finished times, so we have to use a past tense to talk about them. We can also talk about specific days and dates, so we can say on Monday, if we're talking about the past Monday, on Christmas Day, or in 2011. These are all past times, again, finished times, so we must use past tenses, so we can use the past simple. So for example, we could use the sentence, I went to Tunisia last year. Last year is a finished time, 2018 is finished now, it's 2019 now, and we would have to mention this to check that the students understand that now, we're talking about the real now, so we're looking back into the past for the finished time period 2018. So the form of the past simple is much easier actually than the present simple because we just simply use an ed ending on the end of a regular verb. However, there are a lot of irregular past forms of different irregular verbs in English, so we need to do work with this pretty much as soon as students understand the notion or the concept behind the past simple, and we need to start working with irregular forms because they're very, very common in English. In fact, most of the highest frequency verbs in English are irregular, so these are the ones that students are going to be meeting at every level of their study. As a tip, you should find a list of irregular verbs to work with, but don't present them alphabetically. A lot of books and kind of texts present these words as a big long list, kind of randomly ordered or alphabetically ordered, and that's not very helpful. Try and group them together by the structure that they use for their past and past participle forms. And we can find patterns of irregular verbs. So if we find a table which includes all three forms of the verb, again type 1, 2 and 3, the infinitive form, the past simple form and the past participle form, we can find sets of verbs which behave in the same way, so they change in the same way. So we're looking at verb endings, we're looking at the structure of the verb or the spelling pattern used, particularly in the vowels of the verb, which change between these three forms. And an example of this is an I spelling changes to an A spelling, changes to a U spelling. For example, in the verb swim, the infinitive swim changes to the past simple swam, and the past participle swum. So we have that change there, I, A, U, or I, A, A. And that's the same for the verb drink, drink, drank, drunk, and spin, spin, span, spun, and a couple of others. For example, begin, and there are a couple of others as well. So by grouping the verbs together like this, we can help students to remember the patterns rather than lots of individual examples. Another example is the past simple and past participle forms having an OUGHT, or an ought sound. So think, bring, buy, and seek all take the same sort of past simple and past participle forms. Another example is short verbs with a single syllable. There's a big group of these which don't change at all. So the infinitive, the past simple, and the past participle forms are all the same. Okay, moving on to negative forms. Again, this is easier than in the present simple because they all take the same do auxiliary in the past, which is didn't. So every person, doesn't matter if it's I, you, he, she, it, they, all take the same auxiliary, and we can say I didn't get up, you didn't get up, he didn't get up, didn't, always didn't. So that's quite easy to remember. And then in question forms, we use again the past do auxiliary, which is did, and we use the subject after the auxiliary, as with all of the simple tenses, and then an infinitive verb. For example, did I do something? Did you do something? Did he do something? All of the different persons, all the different pronouns take the same auxiliary did. So again, the answer to this type of question is yes or no. Otherwise, we're asking about the subject. So again, we use a WH word just as with the present simple, and then we use a past simple verb. So we have a question word like who, what, why, and then an ed form of the verb. To teach these ed endings, we need to focus a little bit on pronunciation. So there is a pattern to past simple regular verb endings, the ed, which depends on the type of phoneme or the type of sound which is made at the end of the infinitive verb. So for example, we can have a voiced sound or an unvoiced sound at the end of the verb. So as a good step to start teaching this, we need to find a set of regular verbs, some of which have voiced final sounds, some of which have unvoiced final sounds. And we can simply ask students to group the verbs under 3 headings. So the first set of verbs here has voiced endings. So climb ends in a m sound, which is voiced. Remember ends in an sound, which is a vowel. All vowels are voiced, so it must be voiced. Love ends in a v sound, therefore voiced. And hug ends in a g sound, voiced. So we use our voice to produce all of those sounds at the end of the verbs. The second group contains unvoiced sounds at the end. So walk, watch, laugh, miss. So the sounds there are k, ch, f, s, none of which use voice. Now the third heading is a group of verbs which end in the 2 sounds t or d. So for example, want, load, print, mend. They all have t or d endings. So you can highlight the final sounds of the verbs to just show students what we're talking about and which part of the word we're focusing on. And then you can dictate the past forms of these verbs and ask students to notice. Again, noticing is effective. Ask students to notice as you dictate the sound of the ending in each case. So you would read out climb and then climbed, walk, walked, want, wanted. And the students can take 10 more infinitive verbs, and then once they've identified the pattern, which is a voiced ending on the verb, leads to a voiced ed ending. So a m sound on climb is followed by a d, so climbed. An unvoiced k is followed by an unvoiced t. And then want cannot be followed by another t sound because want is strange. So we need to add that syllable to make wanted. So it's an id ending. So once they've identified that pattern, we can give students more infinitive verbs and ask them to predict the ed ending based on the rule that you've been through. So they highlight the final sound of the verb, and then they predict whether it's a d, a t, or an id ending. And they should be able to apply the rule that verbs ending in a voiced sound take a d sound. Voiceless sounds at the end of verbs are followed by t sounds. And if the verb already ends in t or d, we need to add an extra syllable. So they take an id ending. Finally, students can build phrases and sentences, and you can back drill, just as we did with the present simple S endings, to connect the vowel sounds onto following words and make sure they're there in the sentences, and to emphasize that form in context in a sentence. So, a final task. Think about your students and how they deal with past tenses. Do they overuse the past simple? Do they pronounce the past simple correctly? Do they confuse it with other past forms? Do they use it in the right function? So, how could you help them to overcome these difficulties? What kind of tasks, what kind of activities could you lead to highlight the grammar, the function, the concept, and the pronunciation? Again, this is quite an early stage piece of grammar to teach, so really important that we hit all of those areas and make sure nothing goes missing in the student's language as they develop. So think about how you present and practice the tenses using different tasks, and try to include all of these different aspects when you work with regular and irregular verbs, and including the pronunciation.